Starting. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. We're doing a live show on YouTube. His name is Jasun Horsley. I talked to him in 2017. He and I also did a show about an earlier book he published titled Dark Oasis, A Self-Made Messiah Unveiled. And it was about a guy in Canada by the name of John DeRuyter, who is kind of a new age figure. But on tonight's show, we're going to talk about a book he recently published, I think last month. Was it April or May? April or May. The title of the book, which is an excellent book, I've read through it. The title is Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering, and the Psychology of Fragmentation by Jasun Horsley. Jasun, are you there?
Hi, Bill.
Hi, how are you? Good. Sound good and clear. We kind of had a few little technical issues, but why don't we start by you talking a little bit about your background and yourself and how you came to write this book?
Okay. Well, I suppose it started with discovering Whitley Strieber.
Who was Whitley Strieber? Yeah, Communion, right?
So Whitley Strieber was a horror writer, a novelist, who was extremely successful extremely quickly, which certainly with my current mindset I view with some suspicion. I probably didn't back when I first discovered him. I guess my first exposure to Whitley Strieber would have been watching The Hunger, which was a Tony Scott movie. And that was his second novel. His first novel was Wolfen, which was also made into a movie with Albert Finney, which I guess I also saw when I was an adolescent. And but obviously I didn't register the name Whitley Strieber. But the thing is he did become quite popular just as a horror fiction writer. And then in 1987 he released the book Communion, which had the subtitle A True Story, and that was the account of his apparent abductions and experimentation at the hands of non-human beings, including a rape, as it would, technology and perhaps physical, like a actual organic rape as well. His stories are they're very hard to sort of pass out and to extricate the fantasy from the fabrication, from the reality, from the possible metaphysic or psychic kind of experiences that he's undergoing from what I would say that relate to human mind control. But none of this I was aware of when I discovered Communion. I just read about him in a UFO magazine in Mexico, and it took me back to the whole UFO thing, which I'd actually been interested in as an adolescent for a brief period, and then sort of forgotten about. And this was at the beginning of my path as a spiritual seeker. I was in Mexico after having read Carlos Castaneda, and trying to find a Don Juan, shaman sorcerer to apprentice under. And somehow I came across this magazine in deep South Mexico, and I was fascinated by it. I think it was an interview with Strieber, and I ended up getting a copy of Communion when I went to San Francisco. And it's a very powerful account, I would say, even now. And it had a profound impact on me. And specifically, I began to, let's say, use it as a lens by which to try to reinterpret some experiences I'd had in the past, like nightmares and night terrors as a child, and a feeling of somehow being violated or interfered with by something incomprehensible, which I now would attribute more likely to some sort of sexual interference. But anyway, reading Strieber, I went straight for this more cosmic narrative, and subsequently I had quite a long series of dreams and visions myself of some sort of non-human intervention or interference over a period of 10 years or so.
But Communion was huge, wasn't it? Super popular. I mean, I think he sold a million copies, or it's really one of the primary sources for extraterrestrial phenomenon. Would you agree with that?
Except with the proviso that extraterrestrial is not a term that Strieber uses that much. I mean, he sort of sits on the fence there, he hedges his bets there. But certainly in terms of, anyway, it's some non-human slash alien slash extraterrestrial presence interfering. But then the now well-known UFO alien abduction narrative, which of course the X-Files completely popularized and, you know, fictionalized. I'd say you can trace it. I mean, you can trace it back in terms of just testimonies to Betty and Barney Hill in the 50s, but in terms of actually becoming, yes, a popular narrative that was sort of recognizable by millions of people, it began with Communion, I think. Yeah.
Right. It had the cover with the kind of gray alien with the big eyes, very distinguished cover. But that wasn't the only book that you were influenced by that was written by Strieber, right?
No, well, that's the thing, because Communion impacted me that deeply that I read all his other books, and although I would say his follow-ups to Communion, of which there were many, were generally inferior, at least I guess they got less and less interesting, except for providing clues such as I look for in Prisoner of Infinity. But in terms of powerful testimonies, they became kind of less and less interesting to me. But I carried on reading him, and then in 2000, I believe it was, he released The Key. He self-published it, which was supposedly a transcription of the encounter that Strieber had with a god man, like a divine being in human form, who burst into his hotel room in Toronto at 2 in the morning or something, and just started reaming out or reeling off all of this profound wisdom. That's Strieber's account, and he scribbled it down and then later released it. And that book I found at the time and for many years to be a very profound book. Yeah. So yeah, my view of Strieber was, I had a very, very high view of Strieber for many years. I considered him one of the most important and profound thinkers, you know, of our time. But yeah, over time, as you've read in Prisoner of Infinity, I had to kind of recalibrate my viewpoint of him and his output.
And how did that process kind of develop as you kind of questioned what he was up to?
Well, it's like I guess it's kind of classic thing is when, you know, in the conspiracy narratives, or the discovering some plot against you, or discovering a crime's been committed, you know, it starts with something small. There's a clue, which is usually an anomaly of some kind. I guess all clues are anomalies, that there's things that don't seem to belong there, and they indicate something has happened that you didn't know had happened. So with Strieber, it was actually, I think it was related to his spat with Daniel Pinchbeck, although I didn't know about that at the time. But he and Daniel Pinchbeck, who's the reality sandwich guy, the author of Breaking Open the Hens, is a sort of entheogen advocate, got into a psychonaut. They got into a spat because Pinchbeck was claiming that the beings that Strieber was in contact with were malign. This was on Strieber's show Dreamland, and Strieber had a bit of a freak out on Pinchbeck. And I think it was because hearing about that, because I was writing about Strieber, that I was writing this essay that eventually expanded out into what became Prisoner of Infinity over a period of about 10 years. I think because of that, I ended up listening. I wanted to hear the conversation myself, and I was really surprised by how histrionic Strieber appeared to be. Like, I'd already projected this idea of him as this very grounded, very sane, very rational, very wise person, and he came across in that interview as somebody quite distressed, quite fragmented, quite confused, and I was like, well, that's really not the Strieber that I got the impression of through his writing. And
when was that discussion with Pinchbeck? Do you remember?
I don't remember the year. No, it must have been in the early 2000s, 2005, 4, something like that. And I mean, it wasn't a big deal, I suppose, on Whitley's end, but I know that Pinchbeck talked about it and wrote about it, and they had a complete falling out. Like Strieber said, "That's it, you're not my friend anymore." It was kind of almost infantile the way that Strieber reacted to that. And I don't mean this as a criticism of Strieber's personality. Obviously, it's none of my business, but I mean that it indicated a gulf between the sort of the profundity of the information that Strieber was presenting and the person himself, the messenger, the medium,
Right.
or the
I mean,
messenger.
he had that kind of public image too. That was, this is a guy who went through a profound experience with discarnate entities or beings, and I think that he'd be on the top, one of the top 10 people as far as this phenomenon was concerned. And he, in that Dreamland, that radio show, I don't know if he still does it, but that was also very popular, kind of in the vein of Coast to Coast and stuff like that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's hard to say how popular Strieber is. One of his MOs is he's constantly complaining about how few people pay attention to him and how poorly his books sell. But as I said, he was a very successful writer from his very first book. He must have made an awful lot of money on Hollywood deals, and he's continued to make Hollywood deals, sometimes relating to his non-fiction work, as in around aliens and whatnot, and other times relating to, like The Day After was a huge Hollywood blockbuster that was inspired by his coming superstorm with Art Bell. So he's not really a marginal figure. I mean, it depends how you define marginal relative to what. But no, you're right. He's really somebody who's had an enormous amount of influence, even if a lot of it's indirect and sort of under the radar, I'd say.
And then, I mean, he has kind of a curious history as well. You talk in your book, you talk about, 1968 and where he was and what he was doing. I mean, maybe you can talk about where he's from and his sensibilities and, how that influences writing.
Yeah, it's tricky. It really is tricky. He's like an octopus, as I said in the book, not the Strieber himself, but the sort of everything around him and his history. And it's like grappling with an octopus because there's so many different threads of the narrative. And this was really what made writing Prisoner Infinity so compulsive and so rewarding and so difficult to finish, because I kept, every lead I followed, often my wife was actually following them for me and then sending what she'd found, led to this whole new sort of wealth of data points so potentially it was expanding exponentially. So yes, for example, the year of 1968, that became this hub of strange phenomena around Strieber that seemed to have very little, if anything, to do with non-human beings. And as in most of the cases of the leads that I followed, Strieber himself provided it. So when Strieber was hypnotized after his abduction or whatever experiences, he was hypnotized by Bud Hopkins, which is a very key detail, because Bud Hopkins, well, let's say he has some dodgy affiliations, and certainly he was one of, if not the leading proponent in the alien abduction narrative, and somebody who actually worked with supposed participants and putting them under a hypnosis and helping them, in quotes, to remember, in quotes,
Right.
their
Gotcha.
experiences of alien abduction. So Strieber went to this guy Hopkins, and he dredged up all of these memories that included early childhood, later childhood, and the year 1968. And there was nothing specifically non-human about the year 1968, but there were definitely some very anomalous things that Strieber remembered, and they involved this woman that he met in Barcelona, I believe it was, or on the train in Europe anyway. And he went there with Rome, and he has these memories of being in this apartment and being
Right. But he was like
manipulated by.
missing for weeks, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he had missing time. He had these fragmentary memories of taking this bitter substance, possibly being drugged, of them being surrounded by shadowy figures and manipulated, as in physically maneuvered, in order to have sex with this woman. He had a vision of the satanic head in the catacombs of the Vatican, which I have no idea even if tourists can go to the catacombs of the Vatican. Right. And all of this was supposedly going on in this one year of 1968, in which Strieber graduated from the London School of Economics, although he never talks about that, but he's listed on the alumni of LSE, which is a Fabian
Very
school.
prestigious, yeah.
London Film School, which is in his early biography on the back of The Hunger and Wolfen. It says Strieber has done diverse fields, including intelligence work and an underground filmmaker in the late 60s. So who
Was
knows?
there any proof of those films that he made in the 60s?
Well, they haven't been discovered or
Right.
disclosed. I mean, Strieber's referred to it since then. He acknowledges it, or he backs up this claim, and specifically says that he made a film about the process church of the final judgment, who any researcher of conspiracy and such, social engineering, I prefer to call it, knows is a bit of a strange attractor in and of itself.
Well, there's a correlation with his ideas too, because they believe they were in contact with discarnate entities too. You know, when they traveled to Mexico,
Right.
Xtool, they were supposedly summoning these beings. So you know, and how in depth, or what his, I mean, if he's doing a documentary on the process, how in depth is his relationship to that organization?
Yes, and he himself claimed, I think, in conversation with Peter Lavender, it's quoted in the book, that he was contacted by the British Foreign Office in relation to the Process Church and told that they were sacrificing people in pyramids in Mexico. And he sort of implies that the British Foreign Office contacted him in order to recruit him. He doesn't make the direct correlation with the film, as in, he doesn't suggest that the film documentary was an undercover, infiltration of the Process Church. That would be, one could extrapolate that. But as with Strieber's narratives, they don't necessarily come together in a clear picture. You just have these different pieces that become more and more suggestive the more that you look at them. But I'd say, one sort of very striking thing about Strieber, the sort of incongruity with Strieber, is this whole London period. I mean, the way that he describes it suggests somebody who was involved in strange phenomena, who was also involved in the underground 60s London scene, i.e. a hipster. He was hanging out in the Pheasantry on King's Road where Eric Clapton was living. This guy, Martin Sharp, was his friend. This was the lead that I followed to discover all this, because he mentions Martin Sharp in Transformation just in passing. Martin Sharp was the illustrator of Oz magazine, which was it was a pioneering countercultural magazine, like the sort of psychedelic artwork that we're all familiar with now from that period was pioneered by Oz magazine. So even by this guy Martin Sharp, was Strieber's buddy, and that magazine had a piece on the Process Church around this period. So that's the tie. And it also had a piece on Jimmy Savile, who, of course, everyone in Britain knows about, who was particularly active in this period, was involved in child trafficking to the elites, as far as we know, with the Cray twins. And the Cray twins can also be located around this area of the King's Road, like they were running betting, illegal betting things. So anyway,
and I talk about Dryburgh and all those guys in the 60s too, hanging out with the Crays. So there's Crowley.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean,
it's an amazing era too in London.
Yeah, it's a hell of a nexus. You've also got Polanski living there, getting married to Sharon Tate, of course, and he was linked to the Mansons and thereby to the Process Church. Right. So, I mean, it's obviously, one can't sum up, or one can't make a case for a narrative just by juxtaposing all these different elements without taking many hours to do so, which I think I pretty much do in Prisoner of Infinity. But I mention it in a shorter time frame now, just to indicate how Strieber's general persona of this pretty down-home, regular Texas guy who knew nothing about nothing when he had his alien abduction experience, and then suddenly, just all of these kind of things exploded into his awareness, and that's been his persona like throughout his career as a spokesman. It completely contradicts the image and the facts, really, of Strieber as this underground filmmaker hanging around at the very cutting edge, really, of both.
Yeah, when he was very young too. I mean, 68, he had to be in his 20s, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so, he was born 47, so he'd be late 20s. So.
Late 20s. Yeah, it's interesting you brought up William Sims Brainbridge too, who wrote a couple books about the process. One that was just republished in 2017 by Farrell House, who's Parfrey just passed away. He was the head.
The Bainbridge, yeah, but I was just correcting that. He would have been 19. You're right. He'd been very, very young.
Very young, yeah. So he's, a young, impressionable, very heady environment. around these very strange cults who were moving around. And in London at that time, the process was very active. They had their own houses and meetings, all kinds of music, things that, at that time are really remarkable.
Yeah. So Strieber acknowledges his interactions with the process church, specifically their Mayfair flat, their dogs, that he ran afoul of them. He doesn't say why, and that they chased him over the rooftops with their dogs, German shepherds, I think they were. But on another occasion, and this was in conversation with Lavender, in communion, he just talks about running across rooftops because of a raid, which certainly made me think of
some important facts. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's confused memory, perhaps. But anyway, certainly he got sufficiently extricated with the process church, whether, in tandem with his recruitment by the British Foreign Office or not, but certainly that was part of what was going on. He made this film and so on and so forth. And then, in the same period, in much more detail, he describes this ongoing encounter with this Irish woman. I always confuse Irish and Scottish, because Mary MacLean, I think her name is, the founding of the two founding members of Process Church was Scottish or Irish, I forget.
I'm pretty sure they were both from Scotland, or she was definitely from Scotland.
Okay, if she was definitely Scottish, then Rosen
is more,
who Strieber ended up having this affair with, was Irish. Okay, so it doesn't mean it's the same person, obviously, but still same general area. And this woman seduced him to, the way that Strieber described him in the early days was something of a dominatrix, of a very strange, erotic, mysterious woman who initiated him into this deep sexuality that also included this shadowy group that were drugging him, perhaps, and physically manipulating him to have sex with her. And during the same period, he says that he discovered a costume in her luggage that so terrified him, because he thought it was a living being. He thought it was a living being who'd been folded up inside a suitcase. And which is a very strange thing to recount in and of itself. Like, why would somebody mistake a folded up thing for a living being? Presumably because it was so lifelike. As he said, he saw its eye, and he says, or has said, that it was an alien costume. I beg your pardon, a human costume. And I think the inference that he wants us to make is that perhaps this woman was an alien, that, like the female being on the cover of Communion, who pretended to be human and carried a costume around. Now, I'm far more inclined to turn that around and say, well, perhaps part of what Strieber was undergoing or being subjected to through this kind of initiation / exploitation, let's say, or mind control, involved people dressing up as aliens, because there does seem to be there are testimonies to that effect.
Of that happening, right? Yeah, correct.
So perhaps he found a costume that resembled an alien in a suitcase, and that was equally terrifying to him. But whether because he was mind controlled or whether because he's deceiving, I don't know. But that he's turned it around in such a way that essentially he reframes all of those experiences from London as sort of fragmentary memories of early interactions with the visitors, rather than, as I've attempted to do in Prisoner Infinity, to look at all of his experiences with the so-called visitors through the lens of human cult manipulations.
Right. And I think that's really a fascinating. I mean, I had my mind opened to these ideas that you had in your book in a way that I hadn't had in a while, because it was fascinating the way that you juxtapose his things with kind of human psychology, and whether what's happening to him isn't, external from him, but internal, that there's that possibility that this is really something coming out of his own personal psyche, right?
Yes, except I wouldn't say it's either or. And it's not like I'm just diagnosing Strieber as a paranoid schizophrenic having hallucinations. Far from it. Certainly something external appears to have happened to Strieber. Whether it was more than just human interference, I leave open to question. But even if we allow, or even if we restrict it to human, interference similar to what we know about MK Ultra. And by the way, we haven't talked about this, but Strieber's own accounts of his childhood suggest, and certainly the location of San Antonio and the time period of the early 50s, and the Nazi doctor that he names. Not that that name particularly is known, but anyway, just the fact there was a Nazi element suggests that Strieber was a victim of MK Ultra as a child. There seems to be evidence based on Strieber's case, at least, that part of that psychic fracking that MK Ultra was engaged with was geared towards tapping into and harnessing some sort of psychic phenomena that may very well interface with entities out there, or it could be synonymous for it. It's possible that psychic fragments become autonomous and then they become as entities. Obviously I don't know the answer to that, but there's a very long tradition, as you know, of demons and jinn and so on, as discarnate or inorganic entities interfering with human beings. So not just interfering, some of them can be benevolent. That obviously predates MK Ultra. I mean, goes way back, fairy lore and so on and so forth. And Strieber's narratives certainly intersect with that as much as they do with MK Ultra and more modern conspiracy lore. So that is a big question mark, right?
Right, but still, I mean, the way that I think you brought into the psychology of human psychology and his experiences are remarkable and give a lot more credence to this idea that this is some kind of rescue from internal traumas that people have had. And if you extrapolate it out of Strieber, then it would make sense that some of this so-called UFO phenomenon are something happening within the minds of people who've been traumatized when they were young, right?
Yeah, so I'd say within the psyches and the bodies rather than in the mind, because something happens in our mind, it's more like a fantasy or a daydream, whereas this is, as Strieber's case indicates, it's psychosomatic, and not in the sense of being imaginary, but in the sense of actually affecting and coming through and expressing through his whole psychosomatic system. And then, I mean, that does raise the philosophical question of, what is real if not, a full body psychic experience? So it's not, I don't aim to reduce these experiences, but to couple them to the known psychology about trauma and dissociation and our defense mechanisms and the way in which we will create what I call crucial fictions around unbearable trauma, that they do represent something real, but they also conceal it and they disguise it from our awareness so that we won't see the true nature of it.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you kind of likened it to your experiences, to his life and how trauma affects people's behavior. But yeah, I mean, and the other, he had some testament of some very odd things. I think he was really the progenitor of the whole, anal probe, rectal probe story, which is, incredible, all kinds of sexual elements to that. I mean, isn't that really the truth that story that he tells that's been ridiculed by South Park and people like that? Wasn't he the progenitor or the first person to really talk about that, or was it somewhere else?
No, I think you're right about the rectal probe. In fact, it's directly associated with Strieber, and it was, South Park was making fun of Strieber himself there, not just, I think they were.
Right. Well, one of the early, I think from the first season, the little kid, he had the aliens insert something.
Right. Well, but I was thinking they actually had a little Strieber drawing in there, but maybe.
I think you're right. No, I think they did have the little aliens. Yeah, now that I remember. Yeah, it's interesting.
The aliens, yes, but not Strieber himself. But anyway, it's a bit of a sidetrack. But I know that Strieber took it personally. He felt they were making fun of him on South Park, but that may just be because he had this experience and they were making fun of this experience. I mean, that experience is certainly key to Strieber's narrative. He still refers to it now. He refers to it as a rape. He refers to it as something he never fully recovered from physically or psychologically, which in itself is a bit of a red flag, in context of this person who is a proponent for the positive nature of his experiences. Like it's like a footnote. Yes, he's been transformed. He's been turned into this kind of uber shamanic best-selling author who gets to testify and share his experiences of other realities and just has the most interesting life you could possibly imagine anyone having. But there's a footnote, like he, wakes up in terrors every night because and he still bleeds, has rectal bleeding, and he's still traumatized by this rape. That doesn't really belong as a footnote in my mind. That really, it's like again, it's like this reversing. It's like he's inverted something. I would say that something that traumatic requires an equally profound spin to deal with it if you're not going to deal with it, to avoid really dealing with it. Because, I mean, let's face it, if you or I were taken by possibly non-human, but certainly seemingly omnipotent beings in the middle of the night, manipulated, tortured, abused, the possibility that they were malevolent and did not have our interests at heart and were simply doing it for the worst possible reasons would be so terrifying.
Right. Yeah,
it's not already terrifying.
It's odd how they have both of that thing, like this non-terror, but also these entities are, benevolent. One of the interesting things is that alien that's on the cover of his book was female. I didn't know that until I read your book.
Female, and yet apparently had a penis some of the time, at least, because he describes having a penis punched into him and then being forced to suck something which he doesn't name. And there's an awful lot of quite
weird sexual aspects to it.
Imagery and aspects in Strieber's narratives, but he himself conceals them. And I mean, here's an example of literal concealment in his book, The Supernatural, with Jeffrey Kripal, who we haven't talked about yet, but he's as much the subject of the book in many ways. Strieber refers to his very briefly to his period in Europe in 1968 and this woman, and says that they had a chaste adventure together, and that the context for that is, I think, but anyway, he certainly talks about in the same book that he had no sexual experiences before he got married, except this very fleeting thing as a child. So Strieber has rewritten his narrative. I mean, I think he's been continuing to rewrite it, but he's not, as far as, like, if a politician wants to cover up his past, then generally he has a team of people doing it, and they do a very thorough job, I think. They don't leave stones unturned. They just make sure that if somebody's investigating, it's going to be pretty hard to find that stuff that's going to compromise. Well, Strieber, he's got hours and hours of audio footage out there. He's got thousands of blog posts, and I didn't go through all of them by any means, but it never took very long to find something not exactly incriminating, but let's say that invalidated and showed the stark inconsistencies in his narrative. He's all over the map, really. He'll say one thing, and then practically within the same sentence, he'll say something that's completely contradictory with that. And that, to me, is so that then we're talking about something more than just somebody who's dissembling or lying or fabricating. We're talking about somebody who's so severely fragmented that they are exhibiting the symptoms of dissociative identity disorder, as it's called,
right.
As in they shift into different sort of memory streams, different personalities. And
that's interesting. That's an interesting observation. I mean, he came out with a new book that reassesses communion, right, within the last few years. So I was trying to find that online.
Solving the Communion Enigma.
Yes.
Yeah. That had an introduction by Jeffrey Kripal. And of course, The Supernatural he wrote with Kripal together. That was more recent. And Kripal also wrote about Strieber in Mutants and Mystics, and I think another book, also, The Traumatic Secret, was just an essay. So, I mean, Kripal has adopted Strieber, you could say, as his sort of his favorite, his chosen or his pet case study for Kripal's thesis, which is that trauma can lead to experiences of other dimensions and even of enlightenment.
Enlightenment, right? That's right.
And that was really what sparked Prisoner of Infinity as a work, was me confronting that thesis that Kripal has and refuting it, because I think it's completely wrong. Kripal actually also wrote an introduction for a book, The Dark Face of Heaven or something. I forget. I don't know if you know that book.
No.
It's by a woman who also claims to have had experiences of other dimensional beings. And you know, I looked at that. I tried to read Sacred Encounters, and it was just quite incoherent, really. I mean, it was like, you know how the accounts that abductees come up with, they're very fantastic. They take the guise of spiritual experiences, like the people who recount the ways in which they've been transformed, the ways in which they've come into touch with a deeper level of reality. But in many, or I would say most, if not all cases, the individuals who are testifying to this, they seem to be unbalanced, and the experiences they describe, they're like sort of adult Disney movies or something. You know, there's something kind of coarse about the narratives. They're such a literalized version of the numinous and of the divine. Now, I wouldn't rule out that they might be being interfered with by demons, because, you know, I'm not closed to that possibility at all. A Christian interpretation, I know that's been the standard one about UFO.
Yes, I think that's now the common conclusion among the Christian community, that aliens are demons, that they're extra dimensional and they're malevolent. They're not positive.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't go that far because I'm not Christian, and I don't think that Christianity in its true sense is dualistic. I really don't. I know that they have angels and demons, and it appears that way, but I think that Christianity, but you know, more properly understood, and I'm a bit presumptuous here, but let's say the way I understand it, it's not actually a dualistic religion, even though it has a satanic figure. Satan is not equal to God.
Right. Well, that no doubt. Yeah, that's true.
So then demons. I mean, rather than attributing malevolence, I tend to just by their fruit shall you know them, really, to look at the effects. Right. And so experiences, I mean, Kripal's, his argument is that extreme trauma can cause us to, and this is Strieber's too, because it's shattering the mirror of expectation, it can cause us to, or force us really, to let go of our interpretation about reality and to lose our filters, and therefore become open to, exposed to, or vulnerable to higher, deeper aspects of reality. Now, I would agree with that in theory, but you can't separate that. And if you just present that interpretation and you leave off the table the whole psychological
effects of trauma, right? The long-term effects.
The case studies that we have and know about dissociation and how dissociation works. Now, Kripal and these others will say that yes, it's a dissociative strategy, but no, it's not just fantasies that they're having. That through dissociating, they're encountering real realities. Well, okay, but they're still encountering them in a dissociative state, which is to say, as a defense against something that has traumatized.
Unreality or something, experiencing unreality.
I think it's
a difference than a standard person's reality.
That's that's number one. Yes, it's very hard to really integrate it with the consensus reality. So you end up like Strieber, this outlier, this sort of shamanic prophet, techno prophet, who has to have wilder and wilder experiences and keep topping himself, because I would say the experiences, he's starting from a place that's not really possible to integrate. Like, this is why there's this whole ongoing thing about contact and disclosure. You know, when will the aliens disclose themselves to us so that they can be integrated into our consensus? Well, the answer seems to be never. And the reason being, I think, is because they're not really integrable. Like they're
closed off, like the opposite of disclosed, right? They're closed off to only be experienced in different situations or through trauma, which leads to dissociation, which leads to
I think they can only be experienced through some sort of fragmentation and dissociation. As in, if we're fully whole, if we're fully integrated and embodied, and you know, at home in the mundane,
right?
then no, there's going to be no. It would be like this elemental spirits, the spirits of nature. They're in nature itself.
I think
That's my
proving that
sense.
point. Yeah, most of these alien events happen at night, right, in a sleep state or
Mm-hmm.
some other type of state. Usually, they're not walking down the street at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Generally, right? So they're
That's
already
just
here.
Strieber.
Okay,
He
maybe
even
it's
has
true.
those accounts. Yeah, like his publishers saw them in a bookshop criticizing communion and stuff. Like he wants to have it all, really.
I mean, it's interesting you bring up the whole trauma Saville associated with 1968. He was in, I think he was in either Oz or something, or one of these process publications.
Yeah.
But here's a guy who's causing trauma for years, right? And according to some of those accounts, there's ritualized trauma where these people are terrified of Saville, really terrified. And so he's able to, and some of those people are probably those who are fractured dissociative types. I've run into people who were children who went through the Children of God. I was in Berkeley. There was a Children of God presence, if you know that whole pedophile cult. And I didn't know when I was younger, 1920, I didn't know what was happening, but this person would literally dissociate in front of my eyes and just whole different process and bounce back in and out. It was when I'm older and I've read this stuff at a more kind of literal level, I can understand what this person was going through. But these dissociative states definitely happen from people who've been traumatized,
Yeah.
And it folds into MK Ultra and all these things that you integrate into your book. So
yeah. Well, it's such a central part of our culture. I mean, not just MK Ultra, because that has become a cultural commodity with American Ultra and all these movies that are popularizing it, and even X-Files, I think, had some kind of MK Ultra elements in there for sure. But I don't mean in that sense. I mean in the sense that, well, we don't know how many people are victims of MK Ultra or similar programs. The figures vary, as they say, but at the high end, it's very high, as in ritual abuse researchers. I mean, Wendy Hoffman suggested to me that it might be as high as 1 in 100 people who've been victims of ritual abuse. And some of them don't remember it. There's a large percentage who don't remember. I know that can seem like a sort of cop out. Well, you could say that about anything then, right? They don't remember. But based on my own experience, the notion that is rejected by many people, that extremely traumatic events do get blocked out by amnesia bearers, is true.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
I mean, certainly if you're young, okay, if you're older, but the thing is, when you're older, you're not so easily traumatized. But if you think when you're very young, you don't process memories through thought or even visualization. I don't think. I'm not sure about the visualization part, but I would guess you don't. You certainly don't have language, so you don't file memories in the same way. They go straight into the body. So you could remember an abuse thing that happened to you when you were 1 or 2, and you wouldn't know you were remembering it because it would just be a body memory. I think I've had these experiences, certainly in dreams and nightmares, I'd say. I mean, I don't totally assume that they're memories, but I do. I can't explain them otherwise because they're very vivid, but they're purely affective. I just experience the sensations. Right. There's nothing visual, there's no narrative, there's no individuals. It's just a bodily sensation or a series of bodily sensations. So where was I going with this? Oh, MK Ultra. So the extent to which MK Ultra has shaped our culture, particularly, I mean, even if you just have a bunch of traumatized children growing up to be adults and, they're part of the culture, they're obviously going to have an influence. But if, as I argue with Prison Infinity, is that one of the goals and successes of MK Ultra is to engineer cultural figures who will have influence, partly because psychic fragmentation is a way to generate charisma, I believe, because you can create an alter. Like, imagine if you can create a program killer, which is the sort of popular narrative, why wouldn't you be able to create a great folk singer like Leonard Cohen, or a great,
Jim Morrison,
writer like Willie Strieber? I don't know about Jim Morrison. I mentioned Leonard Cohen because there's a lot of evidence that he was
just
involved.
like a weird scenes inside the.
True. I mean, yes. I think.
Who knows?
who knows? But I think once you start discovering two or three, yes, it is a natural extrapolation to at least wonder that, you know, maybe that this is part of cultural engineering, by which if you imagine you have 1,000 case studies or being, you know, subjects for MK Ultra, maybe only 10 of them actually take the program in such a way that they really develop charisma and a charismatic functioning social alter, as opposed to just becoming drug addicts and prostitutes and just, you know, train wrecks. And those people can be monitored, and their career, you know, they get given a guitar when they're young, and then they get promoted, you know, they get, it really, although it can sound paranoid if you say it too briefly, I've found that if you just think through these things, it really doesn't require what skeptics tend to assume, this sort of omniscient, omnipotent control. It requires, you know, a lot of manpower, a good lot of technology, and well worked out strategic thinking, and a very profound understanding of psychology, particularly group psychology. And
well, I'm convinced that some of our political figures have gone or been exposed to some type of government, you know, people like Bill Clinton, who they don't know his background very well. Same with Obama. These guys are very strange, you know, CIA connections, strange backgrounds. So you don't know the totality of what these guys are exposed to, and you know how secret societies or the CIA is really behind some of these figures. I mean, we know that Obama is a very strange cat. He has a weird CIA background, but you know, there's some missing years. Nobody can see him when he's at Columbia. Nobody saw him there. So, you know, where is he? You know, it's amazing that somebody ascended to the highest level of power has you know, vacant days and times. And Strieber himself has strange connections and moving around. I don't even know where he is now, or where's he? Is he back in Texas?
Yeah, no, he's always been in Texas.
Gotcha.
As far as I know, besides touring around and whatnot. So, but yeah, to the general point about public figures of profound influence seeming to invariably have shadowy backgrounds. If you bother to look into them, obviously I haven't looked into all of them, a tiny percentage, but every time I have, I've found that sort of evidence. And well, I suspect that a big part of social engineering, crowd control, you know, directing social progress towards predetermined ends does require and depend on cultural engineering, which is to say shaping the culture. And in fact, you can't really separate the two, particularly in the present age with infotainment and politics as theatre and all of that. It's becoming more and more evident that there's an element of theatre in you know, in politics. And I think that, yeah, like a large part of what goes on the world stage is almost literally theatre, not quite literally, but that it's designed in a similar way. And that one of the things that's occurring to me now is that they as in the social engineers, or the program anyway, requires keeping the different enactments separate as much as possible, so they don't get tangled up, because then it could expose the mechanism. So, for example, with Strieber, if you really put Strieber's experiences inside the context of what we know about MK Ultra and mind control, they become something completely different. And so, and I think you can see this on the internet in terms of, it's what Sims Bainbridge talks about, audience cults, that people gather together around a particular subject, and not just the subject, but how they perceive it, particular interpretation. So this is the problem I'm faced with Prisoner Infinity, and it's the problem as an author, like how to get people to read the book, is because it doesn't appeal to any particular audience cult. I mean, potentially maybe the conspiracy audience cult, but
conspiracy, right? That is a cult. It's not the supernatural UFO, right? I mean, because you're criticizing the UFO kind of interpretation of common things, right? So
yes, it's definitely rains on their parade. And even you've got somebody like Kripal, who seems to be, emphasis on seems, a rigorous thinker who's looking at the phenomenon through an academic eye. Well, obviously he's not. I mean, for example, Skeptico, this Alex, what's his face, Cesaris or something. That guy Skeptico.
No.
Well, he's fairly well known in the field, and I let him know about Prisoner Infinity, and he seemed interested. Well, I sent him a PDF, and he seemed interested. He said, "Oh, let's have you on my show." But then a couple of days later, he sent me a video of a UAP disclosure on a mainstream news channel, right? And we had a back and forth, and I was just being skeptical and saying, well, I think they are manipulating the narrative here, and basically went back and forth, and I sensed more and more that he was pushing to get me to acknowledge that the UFO phenomenon was real and it wasn't simply, a manipulated narrative. And I wasn't going there because I don't know that.
Right.
And at a certain point, he stopped responding, and so I waited a couple of weeks, but I knew he'd reacted badly, and I waited a couple of weeks, and I sent an email just saying, how are you getting on with Prisoner of Infinity? And he ignored it. So essentially, having invited me on the show, he was now ceasing to respond to my emails because he discovered that I took a skeptical position about the unofficial narrative, which Peter Levender and Tom DeLonge are, busy pushing like there's no tomorrow, literally.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you bring them up because their kind of view is similar to what you write about in the book, that there's this whole thing for the space travel that's Strieber, and that's probably, is that part of some of Strieber's, what do you think that's behind him in the social engineering? Is that there's some kind of to the stars mentality from Strieber to DeLonge to Levender?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's why I bring in transhumanism in part 2 of the book, because you can't separate Strieber's thing from this techno-salvation narrative, which, it's essentially the scientific salvation, right. Salvation through science.
You brought up Kurzweil, right?
Kurzweil, yeah. Bainbridge is also a transhumanist. I don't know about Elon Musk and these more, contemporary figures, but I think they're in the same ballpark. Even Jordan Peterson, to some extent, I'd say, that's a bit of a reach. But just in terms of offering these sort of scientific models that are supposed to bring about our salvation, well, transhuman is obviously the outstanding one in terms of, yes, we're going to just turn ourselves into digital data and become immortal and join the universe. But certainly the UFO alien narrative from a positive viewpoint is similar. Like, I used to believe that I was being prepared, or had been prepared, an alien body that I was going to have my consciousness moved into at a certain point when the end times came. I literally believe that shit.
Well, they had, I mean, that's interesting, because I think you bring up an interesting point about this alien body or future body, because both Kurzweil, and there was somebody else in the book, they wanted to not, you said it's not about immortality, it's about resurrection. Like, they want to take the genes from somebody in the past and resurrect them. So kind of some of these more common terms like singularity too, you also brought in an interesting reevaluation of what people call singularity as well. But I thought that wasn't, I didn't know that, Kurzweil, until I read your book, that it really isn't about immortality, it's about resurrection. It's amazing, and it's his dad. So there's this there's a really fascinating theme of psychology that floats through the book about how even Strieber, Kurzweil, these guys long for their fathers.
Yeah, the absent father syndrome and the mother symbiotic psychosis with the mother syndrome. I mean, that's a little tough to get into in an interview, but it's absolutely central to the thesis. And certainly, I mean, the whole thing of space travel, I mean, that's what I look at in the second part of the book, is the extent to which the desire to leave the Earth, to leave the planet and colonize space has been seeded in us from, quite an early time, and certainly back to Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, at least 150 years, but probably more if we trace back anyway. But certainly
Poe to
during
that period.
Poe also, and it's pretty easy to fit the UFO narrative into that, because even though it's not about building spaceships and traveling to other planets, it's about other beings doing that, coming here to us. And so it indicates, that signals that space is inhabited, that it's calling to us. And I mean, what John Mack's book, Passport to the Cosmos. So there's, what's happening is this conflation of this deliberate entangling of the spiritual and the religious drive towards resurrection, towards enlightenment, towards transcendence of the self, towards union with God, and so on, and eternal life, of course. That is getting spliced together with the technological, technology really, and
technology is the active element that's going to bring that about, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, but I mean, the way Bainbridge talks about it is it's a motivator. It's not as though these people necessarily believe that this is possible. As long as they can convince us to believe it, then we'll be motivated to work towards that. So, for example, all these guys in Silicon Valley, well, they grew up on Star Trek, or later generations on Star Wars, and they were inspired by that to want to create technology, to want to colonize space, and so they put all their energy, basically. I mean, you could say that's a soft sort of traumatizing, in the sense of these kids, they grew up in a traumatic environment, however mildly, and they took refuge in these sci-fi fantasies. And so those fantasies became imbued with this absolute drive to escape reality. So yeah, they're truly motivated, and then it becomes literally about either leaving the body, in the case of transhumanism, or leaving the earth, or both, which is about trying to separate from the mother, the matter, from physical, because they remain enmeshed in the mother's psyche, because they didn't have a strong father to fish them out and help them to develop autonomy. So, I mean, that's like a universal trauma. Like, now we live in an age where father's considered redundant. It doesn't matter if you got a father or not.
Probably everybody. What's that speech from Fight Club?
Yeah,
we're talking about we're just raised by women.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've been rewatching Fight Club again. Still a great movie, really good. But yeah, I mean, it's and Kurzweil is now the chief of technology for Google. Isn't that right?
Yeah. It's massive. It's really massive, Bill. I mean, it's pretty easy to get overwhelmed if one were to approach this or regard it, interpret it in a sort of, you've got to do something about it, because we're just surrounded on all sides by whatever this is. I mean, it's like AI is humanity. It's like humanity is becoming a vessel for AI, but then humanity created AI, so then it seems as though we're going to be possessed by our own unconscious. I think it's ancestral, actually. I think there's some dark ancestral thing happening.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because it goes to the title of the book, how you got your title, how this notion of infinity, this eternal concept, this idea, you can still be a prisoner of it. It's kind of a paradox. It's a paradox, right? But I think that these ideas of the, in future infinity, and you tie it back to yourself and your own kind of background as well, which is one of the interesting aspects of this book and the book of Dark Oasis,
Yeah, well, I do. I always try to do that. But I think that's apropos, as far as linking it to the ancestors, that the prisoner of infinity, I think, refers to the attempt by the constructed identity, the trauma-created identity, or the ego, to become immortal, and that would truly create a prison out of infinity. I mean, if you were able to give eternal life to this traumatized self that's just constantly defended against its environment and opposed to reality, that's hell. That's like eternal damnation.
That's right. It's a view of hell. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, is there anything else you'd like to cover? We've done over about an hour, so
we've certainly been speeding through it. I don't usually go this fast. I don't know why.
Well, I mean, I think it's a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. I'd highly recommend it. Prisoner of Infinity. The subtitle is UFO Social Engineering: The Psychology of Fragmentation. You can learn a lot from this book. You have such a wide, broad reference material too of so many different people happening. That it's a great learning. I mean, you mentioned Space Odyssey, Bainbridge, SRI, all these guys.
Well, like I said, it was an octopus. I just grabbed the one tentacle, and I found there were all these other ones thrashing around, and I had no choice but to try and grab them too. Otherwise, and yeah,
I was interested to see the finders in that too. That's like a doctorate, graduate level conspiratorial referencing too.
Yeah, well, and that was via Streba. So there's the odd thing about Streba. This thing they say, the secret that protects itself is also the secret that is trying to expose itself, and that's observable. Streba, like he's constantly dissembling and covering up things, but he's also pointing at things that really indicate the truth. So, for example, he's got a whole chapter on the finders in solving the communion enigma, and it just sort of hangs there. I mean, the context is that something happened to him as a child, right?
You talk about that too, early trauma. Supposedly went to some special school. I mean, if that's a true narrative, or if that's
Monterrey in Mexico school, I suspect that part is more or less accurate, because I've certainly heard quite a few other testimonies about special schools, and even people who were in ordinary schools, and then they're given these tests to see if they were suitable material for special schools. I don't remember anything like that happening in my case, but doesn't mean it didn't happen. But yeah, a lot of people have talked about that.
No, definitely there were some of those around when I was in Northern California. There was what is it, the Waldorf schools, Steiner schools, those were around. They had a nice front. There were Scientology schools. There's some different stuff. Yeah, so I don't know. I saw some incredible stuff when I was in Northern California, because I live close to SRI. I've actually been on the SRI campus. Most people think it's like some small little but it's like a college campus. It's huge. SRI is amazing. And it actually, the driveway to get into SRI is, I think, Menlo Park Boulevard. You drive right by the Veterans Administration place where the guy who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest we used to work. The guy who was the merry prankster, I can't remember his name.
Ken Kesey.
Yeah, Ken Kesey.
Yeah.
When we were kids growing up, we used to go and play golf there at the Veterans Administration, because they had a 9-hole golf course, and we could go and play for free. And literally, right out of One Flew Out of the Cuckoo's Nest, there would be this lineup of these guys all in white outfits. And, I didn't know the significance of it back then, but all that stuff, the LSD stuff, was all around. Kool-Aid acid test. I actually saw Tom Wolfe in Northern California. He recently passed away, but he was in Palo Alto. I ran into him a long time ago. He's very easy to see because he's always well dressed. But yeah, a lot of that stuff intermeshed, overwound. SRI. I know people who worked at SRI. They were weird. I can tell you stories, man. They're amazing. But yeah, there's some strange birds out there, no doubt.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. And it's I'd say that the field that you and I are in terms of alternate research is sort of getting more and more of a minefield. Not that it wasn't always that. Like I said, with this Skeptico guy, for example, like it seems as though it's almost like it's partisan. Like there are things that you believe and you support, the narratives that you support, and you and I, well, we're supporting the sort of pedocracy narrative and the Dave McGowan narrative to some degree, and actually it seems to intersect with Christians, this narrative, a little bit.
They're interested in it for sure. Yeah.
They are, and also like Jan Irvin's just become a Christian, and so it can go the other way. Like I've been I don't say flirting with it, but I've been contemplating it.
I didn't know that. So
John, well, the book I wrote after Prison Infinity, Vice King, is looking into Crowley and Occult Yorkshire, my own path. Just beginning to see, how deep and dark the secular sort of progressive rabbit hole is. It not that it led me to want to take refuge in Christianity, but it just became more and more like a counterpoint, a contrast, like a rock of sanity by comparison. So there is something in that. Like the more we see the inherent malevolence in the world,
and like this kind of connive, like even Stryber, like what's going on with his agenda, what's behind him, and how was he a member of the process? Is he still a member of some kind of weird thing? I don't know. Is the whole communion thing an intentional myth to deceive? Is he being deceived? I don't know.
Well, I don't think it's that cut and dried for sure. And I think that if you want to have somebody who's propagating a narrative and get people to believe it, the best way is make sure that they believe it too.
Right.
And people aren't one thing or another, particularly if they're fragmented, of course. So, but I think that the more important question is whether a person, in this case Strieber, is getting closer to busting their own crucial fiction and really disclosing the truth to themselves, or whether they're getting further from it, because it's kind of either or. You can't just stay in the same relationship to your delusions, and we all have them. You have to either be confronting them and watching them dissolve, which is very frightening, or you got to keep piling on delusion on top of delusion to keep reinforcing them. And I think that the primary indicator that you're going to be doing the latter is if you have worldly success and a lot of validation, because then you get your audience cult, you get people confirming, in fact, the thing with John Deruta, right?
Right.
The larger his following, the more he himself becomes invested in maintaining it, but also the more he can tell himself it's true, because all these people believe it.
Right. Interesting. That's interesting.
And the postmodernists would say, well, it's all interpretation anyway, so what's the difference, right?
Does it matter? That's funny. So anything else that you want to cover before we wrap this up?
Well, I guess I didn't finish that point about our own field, which is this. I just wonder if you have this sense too, that it's quite fraught in terms of knowing who you can talk to without getting pulled into some sort of agenda,
Yes, definitely.
Or whether you will be persona non grata because you indicate you're not going to go along with the agenda.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think that some people wouldn't even touch me with a 40-foot pole just because I have the label of a Christian on what I write or do. So those I'm done with that. And some people label me as something else, which is funny. But yeah, no question. I mean, I actually, you'll see an interview I'm going to do with a guy from the Noetic Institute in a couple of weeks, and he didn't know anything about me, so he was very tentative about doing an interview just based upon everything. And then he actually looked at my YouTube channel and saw that I was willing to entertain ideas from people that didn't fit my mold, So, but yeah, that was interesting. So, some people.
So, which guy is that?
I'll tell you offline.
Oh, okay. Because the Institute comes up quite a bit in Prisoner of Infinity.
Yeah, I mean, right. Dan Brown, all these things. So yeah, but it's interesting. The Noetic ideas they're not like new ideas. They're actually all through Hinduism, believes in all the same thing that these guys Noetic. They just kind of, not that they relabeled it, but they came at it from a different angle. So.
And that they were a front for the CIA with the remote viewing things, yeah.
Right. So I think that's what they came out of, right?
I'm not sure exactly. I just know that was one of their functions in the early days. So I don't know if you're going to ask him that.
Well, you can give me some ideas to ask him. Let me see where I can find it. Anyway, I'll stop the broadcast. But Jasun Horsley, author of Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering, and the Psychology of Fragmentation. I highly recommend this book. It's very well written. You have an excellent prose style, and there's a lot of interwoven fabric in this book. So I definitely think it's a 5-star worth a read. So Jasun Horsley, thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill. Okay. Good talking to you.
Good talking to you as well.